All right, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Paul Gosselin, Gosselin, and he wrote a 2-volume set of books titled Flight from the Absolute, Cynical Observations on the Postmodern West. The first one was published in 2006. The second was published 2009. We're going to cover the first one and really fascinating philosophical inquiry into really postmodernism and its effects and on a wide variety of our culture and thinking. And in his foreword, he has this sentence, which I'm going to repeat before we kind of get started talking about the book. And it is, quote, "Very few people identify themselves as postmoderns, and yet one observes that the behavior and attitudes of the masses are to a great extent molded by postmodern presuppositions." So we're going to kind of go into detail about this radical change in this kind of culture we're in now. So Paul Gosselin, are you there?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, for people who may not have heard your name, can you talk a little bit about your background and what led you to write this first volume of Flight from the Absolute?
Well, my background is in social anthropology, and specializing in religions, ideologies, and belief systems. So that leads fairly naturally into the present culture and the ideas, the beliefs that dominate our present culture. And but just to give a little background, for example, the concept of postmodernism, well, it naturally leads to the question, okay, what is modernism too as well? Because modernism is basically, if you're looking at the cultural history of the West, you have the Middle Ages, and then followed by the Reformation, the Renaissance, which are largely dominated by the Judeo-Christian worldview, either Catholics or Protestants, and eventually the Anabaptist tradition coming along too as well. And but mixed into that, many people will view this time period as, okay, this is the Christian West. Of course, Christianity has had a deep influence on the West, but the West has always been a little bit schizophrenic. You see, the Greek and Roman influences actually has deeper roots in the West than Christianity. So that this always has to be taken into account when we're analyzing events or things that are going down, or attitudes that are occurring in the West. Well, if these things have to be taken into account. So the West has always had this schizophrenia, and then you had the Renaissance was actually one. I look at the Renaissance. The Renaissance is often looked at as, okay, architecture and painting and things of this sort. But the Renaissance was also an attempt to revive an alternative worldview in the West, based simply on Greek and Roman thinking.
Right.
So this was not just an architectural movement, not just an artistic movement with the Michelangelo and many of these major artists, but it was also an ideological movement. I use the hard-to-handle term, the ideo-religious. So basically, it was an attempt, but the Renaissance basically failed in this. It was banking on the great prestige of Greek and Roman philosophy, but at the same time, science was growing in influence and discrediting large parts of the Greco-Roman heritage, and because of that. Finally, as a basis for civilization, it failed in that regard. So the next step, when those in the West were seeking for an alternative to Christianity in the West, they realized that the Renaissance was not going to be able to take them very far. then this was when the Enlightenment, and which is the modern, basically the modern view of man, started to coalesce, and all religions, all belief systems have have a number of basic questions, but one of the very basic questions is, where is truth? So whereas Christianity would answer this, okay, then you have the Bible, or you could add to that, for example, in the case of Catholicism, with the Pope's authority, and things of that sort. But with the Renaissance, the answer that the Enlightenment brought to this was, no, science is the ultimate authority, the ultimate epistemological authority. So that was the basis for the growing. Of course, the early Enlightenment figures were still deists, people like Benjamin Franklin or Voltaire or Descartes. These people were still talking about God, but God, who is just, basically starting up creation and then taking the backseat, going, maybe perhaps spending his time watching The Price is Right and leaving things run by themselves. So this is the Enlightenment view, and it's perhaps you could say the culmination would be Nietzsche's declaration, well, God is dead. Right. So that's the mature phase of the Enlightenment. And so you've gotten rid of the deists. The deist was just a passing phase, and so during the 20th century, actually, we could have Nietzsche would still be a good candidate for initiating the postmodern phase, because Nietzsche was not always a big fan of science. He was at some points he was skeptical of science, and so the postmoderns, typically especially in social anthropology, they would comment about science being, oh, this is just a Western understanding of the world. This is so the postmoderns would relativize the authority of science, the absolute authority of science. So they reject that, but it still has their, so they're generally the postmoderns would be buying into the materialistic origins myth, because that's still convenient. Right. But so we're slowly drifting away from the idea that there are absolutes. The moderns, the Enlightenment view, still agreed with Christians that there was an absolute, but it disagreed about what the absolute was. So the whole question about where is truth is answered very, very differently in the modern context and for Christians. And postmoderns finally arrive when you start to analyze the postmodern view. Basically, there isn't any truth left, or it's the individual. That's what you're left with, and but there's an interesting outcome with repercussion with this situation, though, is that when the postmodern individual is facing the state, which claims absolute power and authority, well, the postmodern has no reference point above the state that it can refer to. So the state can claim absolute power over individuals. So so this leads to some rather interesting political repercussions too, when we tend more and more to in the political realm.
Right.
And
so you see the kind of, you could argue that many of the horrors of the 20th century, in as much as postmodernism affected certain movements, that because people couldn't say God exists as an authority above the state, people just followed in lockstep with whatever state authority said. Would you agree with that?
That can lead to, it depends. If you're looking at specific individuals, of course, every individual can be a mix of different beliefs. So how, when you're looking at specific individuals or institutions, how they're reacting, well, you have to take that into account. You have to see, well, okay, but of course, for example, during as Nazism was growing in influence in Germany in the 30s, I remember reading a comment by Albert Einstein. He says, I was a big fan of, I always been interested in freedom. And when Nazism was growing, I saw the universities shutting down. I saw the media shutting down. And actually, the only ones who were still speaking for freedom was the church. And that was Einstein's comment. Of course, that would be valid if you're applying that to the confessing church, and because many mainline churches in Germany during the Nazi period went along with Nazi politics and everything, and but people like Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, they even Bonhoeffer, even a couple of days after Hitler was elected, when he was at the apex of his popularity in Germany, he dared question the Führer, in other words, the absolute leader concept, in just on the radio, and his interview was cut short. I'm not too sure, but in fact, Bonhoeffer was thrown in prison, and just a few days before the Nazi regime collapsed totally, Bonhoeffer was hanged. He was definitely somebody who had the courage to stand up to this, and paid a very serious price, of course.
Right. So truth is of little concern to postmoderns, but and you say it's not purely defined by French intellectuals. You mention a lot of names that I'm familiar with, but it's not just through philosophy, it's through pop culture, media, advertising, film industry, media elites.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, there is a tendency to view postmodernism either as even just an architectural fad, or just looking at it from the point of view of the French intellectuals, the Derrida and guys like that. Yeah. So, but that's just part of the picture, and there's pop culture is fed into this. And I remember reading at one point Kurt Vonnegut, who was describing his own progression. I don't know if he identified. I don't think Kurt Vonnegut would have identified as postmodern, but when he was describing his own disgruntled migration away from the modern point of view and accepting the ideas that were more irrational. He was talking about not necessarily the occult, but horoscopes. He was saying, well, gee, horoscopes give meaning to people's lives. Why not? Right. So this is drifting away, of course, from the very absolute forms of materialism, which were typical of 20th century modern point of view. Your Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens or people like that. So these are we could call them the apostles of modernism in this present time, in this generation, whereas Bertrand Russell and others like that would have been in previous generations. But so I think there's a basic understanding that the worldview that modernism did provide was rather grim, and there's sort of like an emotional reaction to that, and it's just grim and a little bit barren. It's basically, what are the fruits that this culture has produced? Well, generally some of the darkest dystopias, like George Orwell's 1984 or Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. These are coherent with this materialistic worldview, but they paint a very, very, very grim picture of what life is and how cultures and civilizations based on this view where they arrive, what the end game is for these societies.
Right, and I think you mentioned in your book, like, it's not a coincidence that these dark dystopias were written in the 20th century after all the horrors and everything.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting how postmodernism influenced the culture in kind of, you, in that one section in the first part, you talk about how it unmoored people from former things. So like Spender, we are a lost people. Loss of meaning, Sartre says, absurdism. Yeah. So you see that kind of in our culture, and this kind of deification almost of like people in my era, just their new religion is Star Wars and all of these fictional tales. So
that's part of the picture, because people are groping for meaning. And here in Quebec, for example, during the 60s and 70s, whereas the Catholic Quebecers used to be very, very, very devout Catholics, but during this time period they had what was called the Quiet Revolution, which was basically, as opposed to the French Revolution, which was violent, where the leaders were guillotined and all this. But there was a transition away from Catholic influence, which was both in politics, education, healthcare, which were very, very dominated by the Catholic Church in Quebec. And then after this Quiet Revolution, largely many Quebecers became devout nationalists. So politics, for many Quebecers in those generations in the 60s and 70s and up until the 80s, the whole idea of national identity became a central issue for many, and in some sense, perhaps, an attempt to find a utopia. So this has lost a lot of steam since then, and people are, just making ends meet and dealing with so there's a base. So from one Western country to another, the path for groping and looking for meaning can take different, it can take different paths. But there's evidence of, like you say, the people that you mentioned Star Wars, but even before that, the Trekkies would perhaps even more be even a better the Trekkies. Yeah. I remember William Shatner's rather cynical comment at a Trekkie conference: "Get a life." But for these people, that's what they were attempting to do, actually.
Right. That was popular culture replaced religion. That was their thing. That was their refuge, really, right? That's how they filled the void.
So people were in enacting, finding something meaningful in participating in this, quote unquote, sci-fi myth. And so that does expose the obsession people have with these things. It has its basis in the lack of meaning that generally our civilization doesn't provide. It's so that it's a reflection. People are groping.
Paul, in my era, like, I'm in 50s right now, but there are 30s and 40-year-old men that is their meaning. They on their walls and their man caves, it's all Star Wars and figurines and things. It's really amazing how that this kind of modern kind of culture really has replaced religious iconography.
Yeah, and for others, perhaps in the older generation, there's the Tolkien would perhaps be a more sophisticated embodiment of this sort of search for meaning. the Lord of the Rings, and it has the noble side, a bit of it's a mythology that has more depth, and also their concepts of honor and things like this. So it's got a deeper ethical ring. Anyway, but the basic issue is yes. The West is basically, to a large extent, it's adrift, and it's looking for meaning, and culture.
Right.
Culture is part of it. Culture is part of that spiritual road that many Westerners are on. They're not just trekking off to Kathmandu and trying to find something there, but some of them are trekking through pop culture and things of that sort. So it's part of the deal.
Yeah, and you state in your book, Muslims talk about the Christian West, but that doesn't really exist in the present. Not maybe like it did in the past, but like the elites have definitely abandoned Christianity. But also, I think you make some fascinating points about how, because that kind of Christian or the traditional view, there's now the search for meaning that can be expressed in even contradictory ideas in people's outlook, like these new myths, and you call man's now free to shop the ideological market. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, no, that is part of the situation. Yeah, it's a little bit like when you take your tray to a cafeteria, and people will have a very eclectic way of looking at finding meaning, and perhaps at a certain state in their life, they will. Well, for you, when you're going to a cafeteria, you have all these kinds of foods, and you're staring at all kinds of choices, and you can have tacos, and you can have pizza and some Chinese, and whatever grabs your fancy. You can grab anything that's out there in the stalls. So many people at this point, because of the fact that there's no largely recognized concept of truth, people look at religion. They look at the attempt to build meaning in their lives, but they go at it the same way somebody will line up in the cafeteria, and they'll put a little bit of Chinese influence, some positive thinking, or a little bit of yoga, and they can throw pretty much anything together, but 5 or 10 or 20 years down the line, they can look at that and say, oh no, this doesn't work, and throw out half the stuff and add on other different components. So it's very to some extent, yeah, you end up with things that are contradictory. So it's people look at it very emotionally, what they find some short-term satisfaction in, but inevitably, when you're looking at these things rationally, many of these belief systems or these components of belief systems don't actually work together. They're based on different worldviews, different concepts of truth, and things like that. So, but it's common enough. It's rather common.
Yeah, and you say the contrary views found in Dawkins and Hitchens, but also like how Stephen Jay Gould and Dawkins had this evolutionary view, but their external lives were different than their evolution. I think you quoted Dawkins as saying, like, what does he say? He says, he says that don't question I'm a passionate Darwinian when it comes to science, but when it comes to explaining the world, I'm a passionate anti-Darwinian when it comes to morality and politics.
I think in that quote, he was thinking especially about politics and perhaps the Holocaust or things of that sort, where there had been clear attempts to build societies based on the whole idea of survival of the fittest. So if you're actually empirically applying this, building civilizations on this basis, well, After World War II, the West was made brutally aware of what kind of outcome you can find when you actually attempt to build civilizations on that basis. And anyways, I'm interpreting what Dawkins said. You could always ask him yourself if you want, but I get the impression that would be the sort of that's what he was thinking about.
Right, and you liken kind of postmodernism as an invisible church, like it doesn't have traditional initiation rites or creeds, but there's definitely, I mean, you talk about manipulative coercion. Can you talk about the kind of insidious, kind of invisible influence of postmodernism?
Yeah, well, that is a radical difference. Even if you compare it just to the modern perspective, for example, if you look at two modern ideologies that were dominant during the 20th century, first of all, Nazism and then communism. Both of these had very explicit programs that were written down and could be looked at, and people could analyze. And they also had very clear, in the case of Nazism, well, Hitler's Mein Kampf was basically their Bible. It was very widely printed and translated. And then, of course, for the communists, well, you have the more theoretical work, the Capital, but then more commonly known works such as the Communist Manifesto or Mao's Red Book or things of that sort.
Right.
So you have the program is down on paper. It has the principles are clearly enunciated. Hitler's anti-Semitism was already pretty clear when he was getting elected, when the Nazis were growing in power and then eventually accessing the German state. Though it is also part of the picture that the final solution was kept under wraps for quite a while. This was not immediately put out. This was a little bit too brutal. But still, most of these ideologies had of course, they were based on parties. So they had symbols that were easy to identify. Well, if you're a guy with a swastika comes knocking at your door, you know exactly who you're dealing with. And then if you have a bunch of people coming down the street and they're waving the cross and sickle, well, you know immediately who you're dealing with.
Right.
But the postmoderns have, I think, after the 20th century was over, they realized, well, okay, if you put all the cards on the table and you clearly identify who you are and what you're going about and what your intentions are, this will draw you enemies. It will draw a firm, and it'll basically paint a target on you. So I think there's been amongst postmoderns, I don't know how conscious the process has been, but I think in some cases, I think it's been very, very a conscious decision to avoid explicit programs being put out and explicit organizations with symbols that are easy to identify. So basically, we have postmoderns infiltrating Western institutions and growing in power, either in media, in education, and many other areas, in culture, of course, too, as well. So, but here's the thing: they don't put the cards down on the table. So you have to be looking. You have to put the pieces of the puzzle together yourself, and that makes the whole reaction to this movement a lot more difficult, because it's like a boxer in a ring who is facing an invisible adversary. So he's taking hits. He's getting punched in the face. Taking punches to his body, but he doesn't see his adversary. He can't. He's got a hard time figuring out where are these punches coming from. So this is part of the situation we face now with the postmoderns, and so they tend to generally keep their core beliefs out of view. So
Right.
they play the neutrality game. They just play. They hide behind the institutions they've infiltrated, and they prefer. So they avoid clearly enunciating what their programs are, what their principles are, and here's another thing where they contrast to your typical evangelical, for example, somebody who's if you have somebody knocking at your door waving a Bible at you, okay, you have a good idea what this person is about.
Right.
But postmoderns prefer to use the state and to use the state's power to impose its views upon citizens by either through the courts or through cultural manipulation or algorithm manipulation.
There you go. Like that's the most modern one is the
Yeah,
algorithm.
we have to get up there with the technology, so that's part of the picture now. That's part of the deal.
And you reference in Canada, they had the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982, which kind of reoriented the legal system there. Can you talk a little bit about that and its effect and how the kind of postmodern morality has been inculcated in the legal system there?
I don't know if it's too specific to the situation in Canada. It's Canada's not had something. The Constitution has been not quite as clear cut as the American Constitution. I mean, it's something that's we were for initially Canada was a colony, and it took a while, and we were basically run under English law, and the Constitution is basically set up, but we don't have these the freedom of speech. We don't have any amendment that's clearly enshrines this in law. So these are more like incidental rights, but that could be taken away. We have, for example, an organization, the CRTC, which runs media, which administrates. Well, it was initially organized to administer radio and television, but now they have bills that are in place that are coming down the pipes that would run also internet access and internet media content. So anyway, so this is something that's it can have repercussions on the way we can access internet and things of that sort.
Right, and that's all kind of what you mentioned, Jacques Ellul, and kind of the power of mass media and how that's enforcing this kind of postmodern conformity and stifling critical thinking. Can you talk about how that affects us all, really? Because I think that's definitely happening here in the States.
Well, part of the picture is that once you, as I mentioned, relative to the state, once you reject the idea of an absolute, this provides a reference point. This is critical thinking basically requires an absolute reference point outside the person, outside the person's emotional state, the person's subjective preferences and things of this sort. So when people talk about education developing a critical outlook, okay, then you have to start asking, how do you do that? How do you develop a critical? What is your tool? You need if you're talking about a critical outlook, then you need a reference point. You need a measuring stick to say, okay, well, this is true and that this is not true. You can't just be critical. Otherwise, if you deny that, if you reject that idea that you need a reference point to be critical, then it all dissolves into subjective preferences, emotional states. Basically, it's hardly more significant than somebody saying, well, I hate pizza, or I hate whatever ethical. Your ethical choices or political choices become very subjective, and there's and that leads to a situation where people cannot exchange or debate. How do you debate ideas when everyone rejects an absolute, a rational reference point? And then this leads to situations where people just basically, it's basically like the brown shirts during the Nazi period. They would go to political assemblies from opposing political organizations and threaten and make threats and do violence to shut people up. So right. You end up with a situation where it's basically, like Mao's very grim observation that morality comes out of the barrel of a rifle.
Right. And you kind of do see this today. You see that kind of punitiveness, cancel culture. I think you could tie that into this postmodern outlook. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. You cannot, we're slouching, we're slowly sliding into a situation where real social debate is viewed as something that you just can't do. You basically have to, the person that yells the loudest gets to be heard. Basically, it's you shut up other people that don't have views that you don't agree with, and so we're very, very far from the initial Enlightenment people. Like I believe it was Voltaire who says, "Well, I may disagree with you, but I totally support your right to say it."
Right.
But we've drifted very, very far away from that now.
No question about that here in the States. I mean, that's like your whole section, the Phantom Creed, is really how this postmodern outlook is affected rational discourse. I mean, there's at least in the United States and the kind of corporate media, I would say that's gone. It's really just everything that you include in there, Muggeridge and Chomsky and Orwell all wrapped together.
Yeah. No, for sure.
Yeah. We are at 40 minutes. And was there anything before I mean, there's so much more in this book. It's very well thought out. Excellent book. Highly recommend this, especially for people, because I think it goes back to that theme about in your book is that it's a phantom creed and it's subtle and it's in effect. And it's so I think it's the invisible church almost. It's a fake invisible church that, like you said, isn't something that people can solidify into like something like the Church of Satan or a bad boogeyman they can.
Yeah.
So is there anything like you would like to add? What's your social media? Where can people buy the book? Where's the best place?
Well, it's on Amazon. Basically, the French and English editions are both on Amazon, so anybody could look it up there and pick it up there. There's information on the website, the Samizdat, which is the publishing company that has put out the series. So on the that's Samizdat, SAMIZDAT.QC.ca. And there's publications. There's you have to go to the publications section where the information. So there's information on the book. People can download the foreword to each edition too as well, and get a direct idea what some of the content.
And samizdat, well, that was the underground literature in Soviet Union, right?
Yes, that was this refers to the Soviet period, where the communist regime then controlled all the official press, the media, and everything. So the dissidents, both religious and political dissidents, had to basically self-publish. It was the alternative press of that time. But of course the risks were very, very high. People would basically either type up on their typewriter texts, or handwrite them, hand copy texts, and pass them around to friends. And that was a way of distributing works, allowing free speech to occur. And they always had to be looking over their shoulder, though, just to make sure who they were distributing these things to. But that was the name of the game. But I don't know if we may be getting close to some situation.
Right. Well, people may have to go to this website to meet fellow travelers. You can exchange absolute truth bombs with each other. But again, title of the book is Flight from the Absolute: Cynical Observations on the Postmodern West by Paul Gosselin. And the website again is samizdat. It's spelled samizdat.qc.ca. So go check that out. Thank you so much, Paul.
Okay.
All right. Take care.
Bye.